Hi guys, it's Angie with Fun Endeavors Tie-Dye Lab. Today I'm going to ice dye some sheets, or actually just one big sheet. I don't know if you guys have ever heard of something called a BedJet. I'd heard of it before, but I wasn't really familiar with it. And someone contacted me and asked me if I could dye one of their BedJet sheets. So basically what it is it's kind of like two flat sheets that have been sewn together with chambers in between the two sheets for air to flow up through those chambers and either warm you up or cool you off. That's the simplified version, but I'm trying to describe the sheet to you. So it is one sheet, but it's actually two sheets sewn together. And the sheet is 100% cotton. So I went ahead and pre-washed the sheet in some Dharma's Professional Textile Detergent and hot water to try to get out any sizing or any kind of a coating that the manufacturer may have put on the sheet. Then after soaking it in a soda ash solution and wringing it out until it's barely damp, I'm going to tie this sheet in a random sinew design. I'm going to grab areas of the fabric, kind of scrunch them together, and wrap them with sinew. Sinew is wax coated, so wherever I wrap one of these sinew lines and I pull it really tight, the sinew is going to kind of clamp down on itself and form basically a waterproof area underneath that sinew line. So underneath the sinew line is going to remain white after the sheet is dyed. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and speed the video up while I finish tying this sheet. But even though this is a very specific sheet for a very specific kind of bed, you can use this technique with any sheet set or anything else you'd like to tie-dye. Because the sheet does have two layers of fabric, I wanted to let it dry out just a little bit before I applied the dye. So I placed the sheet on top of a metal rack and put it over the top of a plastic tote so that it could get some air circulation around it. And then we had some storms roll in. Even though it is November, we're still getting really warm weather here, so we ended up getting some pretty bad storms. They actually had some tornadoes in the state. Thankfully, none of them were here, but because of that, I wanted to delay going ahead and ice dyeing this sheet because I like to do that process outside. So by the time the weather cleared, the sheet was completely dry, which is actually a good thing. Because of the size of the sheet, it's a little bit bulky, and that will help me get some better color saturation on my fabric. The person that I'm dyeing the sheet for wanted some moss green shades along with some darker black shades. So I've chosen a variety of colors, and in the photo you can see some of the liquid dyed swatches right up next to the ice dyed swatches for those colors. As I mentioned earlier, I'm going to dye this sheet outside. So I have a plastic tote, and it's one with pretty tall sides, and I've drilled holes in the bottom of the tote because I don't want this sheet to process in the muck. Muck is the term for the runoff from the melting ice that's mixed with the dye. So I'm going to take the sheet and I'm going to place it down inside of this plastic container. Then I'm going to take the container outside and put it on top of a metal shelving unit that I have outside underneath the trees. I like to dye these outside for a couple of reasons. Reason number one is I usually can get the ice to melt a little bit quicker outside because Like I said, it's November, but we've still been getting highs in the upper 60s to lower 70s. So that's going to work in my favor outside today. The other reason why I like to dye them outside is because I'm going to use a lot of ice. So that means I'm going to have a lot of runoff. And I can put this plastic tote down inside of another one, but that's going to be a lot of muck that I need to make sure doesn't overrun and make a mess in my dye space. When I place the sheet inside of the container, I want to try to make sure I don't have it just piled on top of itself. I don't want a really thick layer of fabric in one area where I don't get good color saturation all throughout. Then I'm going to take this container outside and layer on a very thin layer of ice. I would like to have just a little bit of ice on the sheet before I begin to apply the dye. I think with some of the darker colors that I'm using, that may help me reduce some of the speckling. At least that's what I'm hoping for. Okay, so I'm going to use a lot of colors on this sheet, and I'm going to just randomly apply them over the top of the ice. Most of the colors that I'm going to use are from Dharma. A few of them are special order colors, and one of them is a muck dye color, which is no longer available. But let me go ahead and give you the colors that I'm using, and not necessarily in the order in which I'm applying them on the sheet. The muck dye color that's no longer available is Dark Side of the Moon. And then the two special order colors that I'm using are Fatigue Green and Spanish Moss. Then I'm also going to use Timber Wolf, Olive Drab, Moss Green, Sage Green, and Muir Green from Dharma Trading Company, as well as Cotton Black and Sage from Pro Chemical and Dye. As you can see from the photo of the color swatches, most of these colors have some really cool color splits. So I think this is going to give the moss green, kind of darker black look to the sheet that I'm wanting. Okay, so I've applied all the dye, and I'm going to add a little bit of additional dry soda ash over the top of the dye. Then I'm going to actually add on quite a bit more ice. I'm using 20-pound bags of ice, and I think all total on this sheet I probably used anywhere from 30 to 40 pounds of ice, but not all at one time. I put the lid on this container and left it outside to allow the ice to melt. I came back after a little while and I realized I probably just need to take the lid off the container so that it can get a little bit of air flow through there, and maybe the ice will melt a little bit faster. Placing the lid on the container almost formed kind of an insulating effect and slowed down the ice melting. That's great when it's the middle of the summer and it's 100 and something degrees out here, but I don't really need that insulating effect right now. I've included some process photos so you can see what the sheet looked like as the ice melted and the dye ran down through the sheet. When it got dark, I put the lid back on the container, and by the next morning, the ice had fully melted. Here are photos from after the ice melted, and as you can see, the top of the sheet is pretty well saturated, but when I show you photos from the sides of the container, you can see that down through the sheet, there's still a lot of white. I could go ahead and just apply more dye and ice to this side of the sheet, but instead I'm going to go ahead and turn the sheet over in the container, and I'm going to apply dye to the other side of the sheet. This time I'm not going to go ahead and apply ice first though. Because the sheet is already damp, I'm hoping that that is going to help keep some of that speckling down. I'm going to use the same colors, then I'm going to do the same process by adding a little bit more dry soda ash over the top and applying some ice. So you may be asking yourself, why didn't I just muck dye this sheet? Well, partially because I wanted to make sure I got good color saturation. Sometimes whenever you muck dye things, you would think if you had it processing down in a big puddle of runoff from the melting ice that's mixed with the dye, that you wouldn't have any saturation issues. But that's not the case. Sometimes whenever you muck dye items, you can have saturation issues, and have white spots in the middle, just like you do when you rack dye items. If I muck dyed this though, I wouldn't be able to tell what my saturation was. With this sheet, because I rack dyed it, I could look down through the container and see all my white areas and know where I needed to apply more dye and know that I needed to apply more dye. However, if I was muck dyeing it, I wouldn't necessarily be able to do that. I would just have to trust that the sheet had soaked up enough of that dye. So that's why with certain projects, I prefer to rack dye them. That way I can see my saturation a little bit better and make sure I have plenty of dye on the item. There's nothing more frustrating to me than to do something, say like this sheet, and you're spending all this time and effort and you rinse it out and you find big, huge chunks of white. If that's what you were going for, that's great. But if you wanted full saturation, it's very disappointing. Another reason why I didn't want to muck dye this sheet is because I'm using some pretty dark colors. I'm using quite a few darker greens and then some black type colors along with Timberwolf. And I want some definition. I don't want this to just be kind of a muddy mess of a sheet. I want some of the colors to be defined in there. And I think the colors are a little bit brighter, less muddied and dark whenever I rack dye instead of muck dye. I know with muck dye, you still do get bright colors, but the overall look is a little bit more muted, and I want these to pop just a little bit. Don't get me wrong, I really like muck dyeing, but just not for this project. And I keep calling this rack dyeing. I am dyeing it on a rack, but it's inside of a container. But the holes down in the bottom allow the dye to flow away from this sheet, so that's why I'm referring to it as being rack dyed. So after most of the ice melted this time, I came back and noticed there were a few little areas that needed just a little bit more dye. So I sprinkled just a little bit more dye on those areas. This time I only used 1 or 2 dye colors, placed a few ice cubes, and then allowed those ice cubes to melt. So after all the ice melted, I placed the lid on the container, brought it inside, and allowed it to process for a full 2 to 2.5 days. And this is what the sheet looked like just before I rinsed it out. It looks like I have really good color saturation. To rinse the sheet, I took it to my utility sink and I started rinsing it in cold water to rinse out the soda ash and rinse out any of the little bits of dye that are left sitting on top. I warmed the water up to hot and I continued rinsing in hot water a little bit to try to rinse out the excess dye that didn't bond with the fabric. I went ahead and untied the sheet and then soaked the sheet to try to get out the excess dye. I ran some really hot water in my utility sink, added a little bit of Blue Dawn dish soap to the water. I placed the sheet inside and I allowed it to soak. I tried to add enough water that the sheet could kind of freely move within the sink. When the water cooled off, I changed it out, and I did that 2 or 3 times until finally I decided to go ahead and place the sheet inside of my washing machine. I thought I could maybe get it rinsed a little bit better using the washing machine. So I put it inside of the washing machine along with some Dharma's professional textile detergent, and I washed it using a hot water cycle. After that cycle ended, I went ahead and washed the sheet using Dharma's textile detergent a second time. And then I actually washed it a third time. I normally do not wash items that many times in the washing machine. However, because of the sheer size and bulkiness of this sheet, I wanted to make sure I got it rinsed really well, and I couldn't do that in my utility sink quite as well. So I washed it 3 times in the washer. After the third wash, I dried it and ironed it, and this is what it looks like. It's really difficult to get photos of this sheet just simply because of the sheer size. So these are kind of just snippets of areas of the sheet. By the way, if I didn't mention it earlier, this sheet is a queen size. So what do you guys think? I think this one turned out really cool. I know it's hard to kind of get the feel for what it really looks like just getting little bits and pieces of it, but the color splits in this are fantastic. You know, I've got all kinds of greens and browns, yellows, grays, blacks, just pretty much the gamut. I do have a little bit of speckling. I do have a couple areas that, and I think it was probably either the cotton black or the dark side of the moon, possibly even the timber wolf, that threw some pink, and it's pretty vivid pink. And then I do have some pretty vivid yellow in a couple places and a little bit of blue. So that was a little bit irritating to me, but otherwise I think it's absolutely gorgeous. This photo actually shows the entire sheet, or all the sheet that I could get in the photo frame. I've just turned the photo on its side though. The lines are going diagonally down the sheet. So I tied the lines where they go diagonally from the top portion of the sheet down to the bottom portion of the sheet. So this is actually the second sheet that I've done for this customer. The first sheet I used a little bit different color palette on, and I've included some photos of that sheet so you can see it. I did pretty much the same design, so I didn't make a video for that one. I just thought I would include the photos so you could see what that one looked like. But these sheets dye up really well. If you happen to have a bed like that, I was a little bit concerned to take on this project because I wasn't sure how well the sheets would dye. You know, I've dealt with fabric enough to know, even though it says it's 100% cotton, it doesn't always dye up right, especially when it comes to sheets. Sometimes they put some sort of coating on sheets, which kind of repels the dye or makes it more muted, but these dyed up beautifully. So if you happen to have one of these beds, give it a shot because I think these look really pretty. And if you've got some larger projects like this, don't be intimidated to try them. They sometimes take a little bit longer, but I think that it's worth it. So I think the sheets turned out really pretty, but what do you guys think? Please drop me some comments down below and let me know. And if you've enjoyed the video, I sure would appreciate it if you would like it and if you'd subscribe to my YouTube channel. If you'll hit the bell, you'll receive a notification whenever I upload a new video. Thank you all for watching, and I hope you have a great day.